Thank you, Saudara Fadli. Yeah. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Yeah, very good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for your time. This is Saturday evening and it's raining out there. And I'll be speaking, sharing some of my readings on the Kitab Kuning, all classical religious corpus that have emerged, evolved in the Malay world, Malay Indonesian world, for many centuries, and until today, it is still being used, still being discussed, debated, and I'll be sharing, a larger map about this very topic. All right, allow me to share the PowerPoint screen so that it will facilitate my sharing session. All right, Fadli, can you see? Yeah, all right.
Yes, Dr. Azhar. Yeah.
All right, thank you. So the title is Santri and Kitab Kuning, Intellectual Traditions of the Malay World. So what is it all about? As you may know, I'm trained in literature, classical lit and modern literature. I teach at NUS, both classical and modern Malay Indonesian literature. And via my training in Malay Studies, one of the subset of corpus or text that we must read is actually Kitab Kuning, otherwise also known as Kitab Jawi, depending on where you are and what kind of what preference you want to use, whether it's Kitab Kuning or Kitab Jawi. So by virtue of my training, I'm looking this as standpoint of literature student, one who appreciate also the intellectual heritage of the region, and also looking at the kind of orientation, looking at the kind of contestation and the kind of evolution of these texts. So that's how I frame this. So it's nowhere that I'm going to deliberate, on the finer details of the theological. That's why the subtext of this talk is intellectual tradition, rather than speaking from a standpoint of theological premise. There's nothing wrong, of course. Most of these works are theological work, right? But I think I leave it to the experts, the asatiza, or those students of religion, or students of Islam, to deliberate more on those aspects. All right. Let me start, with a quotation here, just to give you some kind of idea about the narrative, the articulation, the expression that one can find from this corpus, works called Kitab Kuning or Kitab Jawi. So one of this, there are many writers, of course. There's one among many of the writers is Sheikh Daud Ahmad Al-Patani, who emerged from the place called Patani, which is in southern Thailand, north of the Malay Peninsula, and Patani was known for its long tradition of Islamic learning, with the institution called Pondok, which is like a boarding school for religious students. So here I have the quotation in Malay and the translation in English. So allow me to read in Malay, and for those of you who just want to follow, you just can read the one in English below it. Maka dibandingkan setengah ulama yang berjalan kepada Allah itu umpama orang yang hendak musafir, maka memutuskan segala marhala yakni perhentian. Maka tak dapat tiada bagi orang yang musafir itu di dalamnya perjalanan daripada mu'alim yang tahu dengan jalan itu, dan berkehendak pula kepada bekal dan kenderaan dan taulan dan senjata bagi melawan akan seteru dan menegah akan dia. So it is something about the highlighting the experience, the endeavor of traveling to learn, which is very much actually part and parcel of the life of the Santri. Santri, basically means student of religion. So a student of religion is one that have to go through this kind of life. Moving from one place to another upon completion, studying under one tuan guru, or ulama, where after certain years, that particular santri will be bestowed the ijazah, kind of a license to teach, license to disseminate the teachings. Right. Basically, ladies and gentlemen, I'll just very briefly talk about the intellectual tradition of the Malay world. We need to understand the kind of traditions that are made available, right, which we can find in the Malay world, the Malay Indonesian world for this. Sometimes we call it Nusantara. One will be the feudal tradition coming from the court, right? Court have the interest to project their power, to record their dynasty, right? To remember its achievements, right? Genealogies and so on, right? So these are court literature basically, with a strong emphasis on its authority, its power, its authority, and of course, within that, the kind of values that it wants to project, to the Raja. Amongst a very strong theme in court works, basically on the emphasis of complete loyalty, kesetiaan mutlak, absolute loyalty to the ruler. And then, of course, from the court, we have the religious circles. Okay, so this is where just now I mentioned about the the endeavor of student of religion, moving from one teacher to another, different places, So they must be ready to. That's the reason why the word santri, dagang santri, came about, etymologically speaking, right? Right. Fadli, I'm in a third screen. Can you see?
Yes, Dr. Azhar.
Okay,
Actually,
good.
I've just received your file, but
I think I just do this one.
you just do this.
Yeah,
Okay,
this is
no
fine,
problem. Okay,
okay.
no problem.
So the intellectual tradition of the Malay world, I've mentioned just now, there's the court, that produce works that to legitimate their power, and then we have outside the court, the ulamas, they could be being patronized by the court, the rajas and the sultan, or they could be independent of that. So the ulamas and of course the student of the ulama are called santri. And in the process, during the process of Islamization, we say beginning in the 12th or 13th century, right? They were roving students going around, spreading the word of Islam. And then, of course, these scribes, roving scholars, these are talented people in that sense, learned men, who either become copies, become secretaries, or become teachers who move around the region, right? And these are, a group of people also producing texts. One we can say one example is Munshi Abdullah or Tuan Simi in Singapore, right? Both of them coming from Malacca, and Tuan Simi maybe from South Thailand, right? Coming to work with the British in Singapore. Then, of course, we have transient traders and nahodas, from time to time, these are also men who, we have not come across women anyway, men who, who were very much attached with the Malay world, they could be from elsewhere, or they could be, coming from a certain respected family, resources to write, and to record their experiences. One example is Laudin, who wrote this hikayat Nahoda Muda. So there's a variety of intellectual tradition. But today we are zooming on the religious circle, the ulama and the santri. Right? All right. So Fadli, I mean the fourth one, I just want to check again.
Yeah, can
Okay.
see.
All
Yeah,
right.
very clear.
So the references on santri in old Malay documents, we come across dagang santri, or santri. At times, the word talib is also used. As you may know, the word Taliban, which means the student of religion. Old Malay word is talib. Talib is also student of religion. Of course, they are not Taliban as in the Taliban that we understood today, of course. So the etymology of santri could be, some would say it's a Sanskrit word, some would say it's a Tamil word, right? But of course, it has been used in Javanese, used in Malay and other languages in island Southeast Asia, right? The word for religious person in this part of the world, sometimes known as ulama, a learned man, sometimes also called as hukama, sometimes pendeta, sometimes tuan guru, sometimes kiai, sometimes mubalik, and later on this group of people who live in a certain enclave, they are called kauman putih, right? Just like in some Javanese towns, the learned Muslim group will live in a separate district of kauman. Let's say in Jogja, you see there's a kauman in Yogyakarta. And then amongst this religious group, you have mystics and Sufis. They in text, sometimes they are called orang kamil. This is a word, not my word. This is a word by Hamzah Fansuri. They can be called in generic term orang pertapa, one who, an ascetic, or ahli al-salik, which is an Arabic word for adepts, or Sufi adepts. Of course, today we have another variety of words being used to denote religious people, personalities of community. Could be ustads, da'i. Piu means pencetus ummah, which is a new term created in Malaysian media. There's also a word called protas, professional ustads, and many others that are being used currently. There's even what Ustad Celeb, means Ustad celebrity. I mean, these are quite interesting etymology words we use, right, to describe religious personalities in this region. All right. So the type of intellectual tradition, if just now I mentioned about those three, those four, but if you move as an orientation, right, of text, you begin to see, right, there are various variants that can be easily discerned from Malay texts, from the Malay Indonesian corpus. The one that I mentioned is feudalistic, one is sophistic, the other one is humanistic, one is theological legalistic, which is religious manuals and religious laws, and of course the other one, which is not a written text but an oral common folkloristic. I mean, this is from the oral tradition, right, which is not written. Only later on they were recorded and published, much later in the 20th century, right? So basically this is a general typology. So we know very well that the process of Islamization in this part of the world witnessed one of the most, say, successful Islamization in the history of propagation of Islam in the world, right? It was on the last place in the globe that received Islam, actually, right? After Islam, from the Arabian heartland, right, moving up north, to the Fertile Crescent, all the way to North Africa, even to Andalusia, to the borders of Europe, moving to South Asia, Central Asia, South Asia, to even to China, and later on, lastly, the place called Nusantara, or negeri di bawah angin, land below the wind, right? Because of the monsoon region of this, known to be by the Arabs in the up north, yeah, in west of Asia, right? And this process of Islamization was um, was carried out, yeah, in various stages, yeah, and there are various agents of Islamization, yeah, that can be that we can identify, yeah, right. Uh, Amongst them, of course, the role of ruling class, the role of Muslim traders, and the role of Sufi missionaries. I will not go into details on this. This is actually, many have deliberated on this, but as you may know, um, the 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 effects of the not effects, sorry, the materials here that we have, yeah, cannot lead us to a certain, yeah, where precisely at which year and the agency that involved in this Islamization. So there are scholars propounding theories of Islamization. It's a very interesting study too. Yeah? But nevertheless, we can say roughly the first three ruling class, traders, and missionaries, Sufi missionaries played a fundamental role, to a point that uh, later on, Southeast Asian world saw one of the most populous Muslim region in the world. Yeah? Indonesia alone is the most populous Muslim nation in the world today. All right. So, what are the Santri roles? So, Santri, as I need to repeat again, they are students of religion. Yeah? It's not an Arabic word. It is used. There are many Indic or Sanskrit, Hindu Buddhistic words that retain in the usage of Malay language. Yeah? Words like Shurga, which to denotes heaven. The Arabic is Jannah. Words like puasa, which is a Sanskrit for fasting, which is the Arabic word saum, yeah? And word like the very basic agama, right? Which means religion, or adin in Arabic. Yeah? So various vocabulary, yeah, number of vocabulary from the Indic languages, yeah. By Indic, I say it could be Sanskrit, could be Tamil, or could be any other words, yeah, from the Indian subcontinent being used, right, retained, and given the Islamic interpretation to it. Yeah? So, Santri is one example. Yeah? So, Santris are, they could perform the role as teachers and preachers. They are involved in the production of religious tracts and literature. Right? In other words, they are not just teaching, but they are writing. And of course, they are also as translator, adapter. Sometimes it's not a translation, faithful translation, but they adapt according to the needs, and they disseminate, right, the works, yeah, in terms of even copying it. Yeah? So the Santri are amongst the very few who were literate during that time. Right? With the example of some other literate group, it could be those court poets, yeah, and scribes. So what is interesting is that the nexus of ulama throughout the region, right, will also imply the nexus of kitab tradition. What I mean by that, works that being used in Aceh, all right, will also later on could be found in Riau, could be found in Borneo, could be found in Sulawesi, and of course could be found in Java, right? One text that being produced in a particular place called, let's say, Pontianak, could later on, right, spread to Riau, to Sumatra, to the Malay Peninsula, and vice versa. So there is always these exchanges. Right? But what is important for us to take note is that the nexus, all throughout this nexus of the ulama and the kitab tradition, kitab means in Arabic book, yeah, but in the usage of Malay, it only refers to religious book. Yeah? And that classification is actually rather strict in Malay, right? I mean, they will not call any book called kitab, only book with religious implication are called kitab. So, but coming back to this nexus, but of course, the paradigm, yeah, or the learning centers is of course always Mecca and Medina. This is of course before Muslim going to Egypt or Cairo, Al Azhar. Before that, right? Mecca and Medina was always, especially Mecca, right, where the Muslim students, or even learned ulama, sometimes even stayed most of their lifetime in Mecca, learning about Islam, teaching about Islam, become prominent figures of Islamic learning in Mecca, and still, of course, writing in Malay. And that's very interesting. Some of them later on came back, some of them just stay there and never come back. And of course, the interaction with India, Muslim India, Mughal India, or the Tamil Muslim regions in southern India, there's always interaction. Yeah? How do we know that? Based on the text that being used in, say, in India, that also could be found in Southeast Asia. Right? So the leading ulamas, they have written substantive work in Malay, Javanese, and of course Arabic. And this is the contribution of the kind of what today we call Nusantara Islam, Islam that emerged in the Malay Indonesian world. So what is this Kitab Kuning or Kitab Jawi is all about, right? What are some of the main themes that you can define? One, on creedal tracts, Akidah, Akaid. Yeah. So this is about, kind of like affirmation of the faith. Yeah. And then, of course, another one is the long way of explaining, say, for example, the attributes, the essence of God. This is a more speculative type of discussion, a highbrow kind of theological, philosophical questions, yeah? That demands that student of religion to study with a proper guidance from a Tuan Guru. Yeah. So this is it's no easy task. Yeah. And they have to read from one kitab to another kitab, right? A various school of thought within the Islamic tradition, and knowing, the kind of position and the kind of differences amongst them, right? But generally in Southeast Asia, the kind of affiliation, theological affiliation, is the theology of Ash'ari and Maturidi, right? So these are, two main school of thought within the Sunni world that Southeast Asian subscribe. Yeah? But when it comes to, say, legal precepts on legal means, on laws, on regulations, yeah, on how Muslim ordered their life, yeah. Generally, Muslim in Southeast Asia affiliated to the Sunni school of Shafi'i, yeah, Mazhab Shafi'i. So it's whereas in some other parts of Muslim world, they could be Hanafi, they could be Malikite, Maliki, or they could be Hanbalite, Hanbali. Yeah? But in Southeast Asia, predominantly from Aceh right up to Moluccas, generally Sunni and Shafi'ites in their outlook in terms of affiliation. And then, of course, we have Quranic exegesis, tafsir. Yeah? This is not many, yeah, coming from the region, but during the classical period, there's one or two that outstanding ones. One example is, later on I'll mention, Abdul Rauf Sinkil, yeah, who made that tafsir. Of course, hadith means the prophetic traditions and sayings. Yeah, hadith studies are very much highly demanded to the students of religion, that they need to memorize, they need to understand, they need to link, right, with various theological position and the way Muslim conduct their rituals, yeah, with the justification from hadith. And then, of course, this is not enough. Yeah, there is another element called tasawwuf. Tasawwuf means Sufism, right? How Muslim understand, in that sense, right, the as esoteric, 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 understanding of religion, this inner dimension of religion, the mystical dimension of religion. The tasawwuf is actually a huge corpus, more than 1/4 of our texts in Southeast Asia, in Malay Indonesian world, of this tasawwuf genre, and many of these could be as simple ascetic kind of tasawwuf, which is the call for leading a frugal life, or it could be a more what I call it, a speculative theosophical kind of tasawwuf, or Sufism, if you want to call it, which is one which is very popular in Southeast Asia. It was called Wahdatul Wujud, or the unity of being, at times also understood as Martabat Tujuh, the 7 grades of existence. And in between that, there are various tasawwuf teaching based on a particular membership in a Muslim brotherhood. Not Muslim Brotherhood of Egypt, of course, Muslim Brotherhood, mystical brotherhood. It could be Shadli, it could be Naqshbandi, Qadiri, and so many various what do you call it, mystical brotherhood. And then, of course, we have Kitab Kuning that explain about the life of pious men, right? With their supernatural feat, with their piousness, right? With their miracles, So it's very interesting that this hagiography is part and parcel of this Kitab Kuning. And of course, the 8th point is the manuals. These are very times very technical, very very practical kind of works, that enable Muslim to conduct their religious life better. Okay, so so Kitab Kuning, Kitab Jawi were all written in the Jawi script. It could be in, as we know, I've given a lecture in this series on the Jawi tradition. So the Jawi is Malay language written in the Arabic Persian script, or Arabic script rather, right? Arabic script, and it is not Arabic, of course. The alphabet is Arabic, but the language is Malay. So, and this is where we make a distinction between later on works, in the 20th century, religious work started to be produced in a Romanized Malay. Malay call it Rumi. So that's where I think, etymologically speaking, the term Kitab Jawi comes also, to be understood, in reference to why, the word being used, Kitab Jawi. In the past, there is, in many texts, it says Kitab Jawi or Bahasa Jawi, it means Malays. But this is quite interesting in Southeast Asia. Jawi in Java could also mean Javanese. So this is some kind of intricacies, depending on the context you use. All right, and then Kitab Kuning, there is a reason why it is called Kuning. There is a possibility of the color and the quality of the paper being used. Or Kuning could also indicate a kind of sacrality of this work. I leave it to historian to or linguist to trace the etymology of Kitab Kuning and Kitab Jawi as a usage of these terms. All right, so this is where I mentioned about Jawi, the difference between Kitab Kuning and Kitab Jawi. The Indonesian generally will call it Kitab Kuning. Right? The Malays also use Kitab Kuning, but in the peninsula, in Malaysia, or maybe in some parts of Sumatra, the word Kitab Jawi is being used. It's also in the Malay text also called, identify the work as Kitab Jawi. Fadli, is all okay?
Yeah, everything's okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
So, now let's locate that. First, we have said about Santri. Then we have mentioned about the kitab that they use, the work that they use, right? Mostly it is in prose or verse, yeah? Mostly, of course, in prose. Yeah? But of course, it's quite interesting to look at this kind of work. It has that kind of not like a textbooks today, like religious textbooks are very dry, very orderly. It has even some insertion of Syair, Mahnawi, Rubai. These are all um, classical forms of poems. Yeah? So it's um, no surprise, that you can sense that even in the study of this text today, we call it sastra kitab, right? Dewan Bahasa and Pustaka in Malaysia term it as sastra kitab because it has that kind of literariness. It's not plain textbooks. So that's where to me, it's an attractive way of understanding Islam. Yeah, it has that aesthetic touch to me, okay? And I'm very much always impressed by the kind of metaphors, symbolism that being used in this kind of corpus. Yeah? The language is beautiful, I would say. Yeah, and the imageries are very interesting. So let's locate now the place where this corpus of work, Kitab Kuning, Kitab Jawi being studied. It is called Pesantren. This is basically in Java, and Pondok in the Malay-speaking area, be it in Malay Peninsula, in Jawa, in Sumatra, or in Borneo. Yeah. So yeah, only later on the term madrasah came about. I think in the earlier 20th century, or maybe the last years of the 19th century to the early decades of 20th century, the term madrasah. And as you may know, one of the first madrasah in the Malay world is Madrasah Iqbal, 1906-07 in Singapore. Very interesting, right? And before, another madrasah emerged in Yogyakarta under the headship of the famous Kiai, um, the founder, the Kiai Ahmad Dahlan, the founder of Muhammadiyah. Yeah? All right. So this is where the pesantren, which is like a boarding school, it's a self-sustaining community with a tanah wakaf, means it's a land which has been, gifted by a certain donor to be used for the religious purpose, right? And it is headed by a charismatic Tuan Guru or Kiai, yeah, and it is the Kiai that determines the kind of text that that he wanted to use in his pesantren. Because over time, we also know that there is Nyai also, female religious teachers, especially those that what we know in Java, but I have not come across from the peninsula, right? So I mentioned here, the text used depend largely on the teacher's affiliation. For example, if the teacher has a strong legalistic affiliation, then more kitab fiqh being used, as opposed to, let's say, there's a more affiliation to Sufism, to mystical dimension of Islam, right? There is a most likely Sufistic kind of work being used. All right, and of course, ideally, the student, the Santri, will move around to study under the guidance of different gurus or ulama. Yeah, so this is an important. This is also a facet within an Islamic tradition that recommend students to go around to learn from others. Yeah, from one teacher to another. Right. So, talking about the kitab tradition, right? We cannot afford to ignore the intellectual luminaries. Since I'm talking about intellectual traditions, I need to mention a bit about some of the outstanding intellectual luminaries, yeah, from the region, right? On the earliest, we know Hamzah Fansuri, purported to be the first creator of Syair. This is a thesis by Syed Muhammad Nagib Al-Attas. Yeah? And in fact, Syed Nagib's PhD thesis was on the mysticism of Hamzah Fansuri. Yeah? A mystic, yeah, hailed from a place called Barus, Yeah, there's a specific area called Pansor, yeah, Pancho, and that's Pansori is the name where he came from. Hamza Pansori, yeah, Pansor. Yeah. Samsudin al-Sumatran purported to be his student or even his friend, yeah, a disciple, known to expand, yeah, and make kind of exposition to Hamza's work, especially Hamza's Sha'ir. Yeah. Hamza wrote in verse also, both prose and verse, and he wrote many beautiful Sha'ir. Yeah, I given one lecture on Hamza few months ago. Yeah, and Samsudin is one of the best commentaries on Hamza. Yeah, they were contemporaries, and Hamza, Samsudin, you see the word here, Al-Sumatrani, and sometimes Samsudin Pasai, you know, depending. Pasai is one of the old polity, the oldest Muslim polity in Sumatra. So whether Samsudin Pasai or Samsudin Al-Sumatrani. Then we have another scholar by the name of Sheikh Nuruddin Al-Raniri. Ranir is a place in Gujarat in India, purported to be a scholar of mixed marriages between a local woman and someone from from Gujarat. Yeah, a learned man who wrote many beautiful things in the Malay Islamic corpus. One of his outstanding achievement is the writing of Bustanul Salatin, right? Which is actually which means the gardens for the rulers. Yeah, it's actually an encyclopedia, yeah, of various forms of knowledge, yeah, that he arranged. In fact, he was, I mean, he styled himself, or he emerged as a contender of the teachings that Hamza and Samsudin were associated with. That is the teaching of Wahdatul Wujud, form of speculative theosophical mysticism, yeah, that Hamza and Samsudin al-Sumatani were propounding, and Nuruddin Anari opposed to it and saying that it is um, 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 you know out of it's aberrant, it's out of Islamic teaching, and then of course there's a lot of contestation here. I will go very briefly later on. Yeah, but Nuruddin Aranderi is one of the a learned man. Yeah, whether you agree or disagree with his position on Wadatul Wujud is another matter. But the point here is that he also produced a number of many good works. And then after that, there's this personality, yeah, from Singkil. Singkil is also a district, within the Acehese polity. Abdul Rauf Singkil is the what do you call it? The nephew to Hamza Fansuri. So it's quite interesting. These are people of related groups. Yeah, I mean, these are religious elites of that time. They wrote many beautiful pieces. They must be elite because they are not some simple Pondok writing for simple religious manuals. No, these are great thinkers of their time. Yeah? Otherwise also known as Sheikh Wala. I will come back to Abdul Rauf Singkil later. He produced one of the finest work in the Malay corpus. And then we have another from the Borneo, Banjar, Muhammad Arshad al-Banjari, right? And then we have also one, Daud al-Fatani, and also al-Palembani. So depending on the region you come from in Southeast Asia, you could be al-Funtianaki, which means you come from Pontianak. Al-Fatani, you can come from Patani in southern Thailand. Al-Banjari, Banja in Borneo. All right, or a few other places, yeah, with Al Minangkabau, for instance, which comes from the place of Minangkabau in Sumatra. All right, so what are some of the popular texts in Pondok used in Malaysia or southern Thailand? Yeah, I've no data for now. Yeah, for Javanese Pondok Pesantren, but generally. Abdul Rashid Banjar and and Mutiara's Tauhid, Pearls of Monism were widely used. Yeah, I think I left out the title that Abdul Al-Rashid Al-Banja wrote there. My apologies. Yeah, I can't remember. But anyway, what is interesting is that the Kitab Kuning or the Kitab Jawi could be translated or adapted from original works, or it could be an adaptation, or it could be just word-for-word translation. For example, we have this Arabic original al-Barahim by Al-Sanusi, right, which had been translated into Malay by various three personalities given different titles. And this is very interesting. Yeah, so all of them come from different places. Yeah, Muhammad Zain bin Jalaluddin Bidayat al-Hidayah, right? I'm not sure which part of civilization he came from. Yeah, most probably in Sumatra. And then we have Muhammad Zain al-Bidin Muhammad Badawi al-Sambawi from Sambawi, Siraj al-Huda. And then we have Zain al-Abidin bin Muhammad al-Fatani, Aqidat al-Najim. Right? So you can see, one text, but being translated by various. And of course, there is a need at that time. Yeah? And these are all handwritten and then later on copied. This before the arrival of printed text. Only later on it was printed. And it's quite interesting that al-Barahin was also mentioned by Munshi Abdullah, because he mentioned that this text being used in Malacca, and as much as Raja Ali Haji in Riau mentioned about the text being used. All right. Let's move on a bit on the controversies of Sufi teaching. Yeah? Studying the intellectual corpus of the Muslim intellectual corpus in this part of the world, you cannot be naive simply studying text. Yeah? You must always place this, in my reading, we need to place this in the context of the time where there is a contestation of power. Right? Just in as much as we do see today, that religious discourse is not free from some kind of political maneuvering and some kind of political interest at work. Yeah? So here, if we look, if we see some episodes that happen, yeah, certain kind of Sufi personalities being executed. Yeah, and when we look at the controversy, then we can begin to see a kind of contestation, the kind of rivalry within the religious fraternity. Yeah, there is a kind of if your teaching is deemed as aberrant, un-Islamic, yeah, which is not in consonant with the teachings, the orthodox teaching, then you can be subjected to suppression or in fact even annihilation. Right? So we know very well there's always a movement towards harmonizing between Sharia, I mean the orthodox teaching, the orthodox understanding of Islam, and Sufism. All right. And of course, each group will want to legitimate that their position is legitimate, including Hamzah Pansuri. Hamzah Pansuri, known for as a propounder in the region, as propounder of Wahdatul Wujud for the region, also in his text trying to say that there is a need to affirm the Sharia, not to abandon the Sharia. So what happened if you see in 1640, a person by the name of Kamaluddin Jawi, who was the followers of Samsuddin al-Sumatri, was beheaded and the books burned. Right? This is one of the many stories about the suppression of Sufi works in Aceh.